Well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining our Zoom meeting this morning, where we'll be learning and discussing a little bit more about emerging carbon markets and important considerations for farmers to be aware of. We are recording the meeting this morning in order to provide this information as a resource to the members of the Minnesota Corn Growers Association following this presentation and discussion this morning. This morning, we're fortunate to have Dr. Gary Schnitkey, Krista Swanson, and Sarah Sellars from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. They're going to present some information about carbon markets. Dr. Schnitkey and his team have presented this information at a recent National Corn Growers Association meeting and to other groups of farmers as well. And we appreciate them taking the time to present this information and have a discussion with farmer leaders of the Minnesota Corn Growers Association. One housekeeping item before I turn it over to Dr. Schnitkey is there will be time for questions and discussion following the presentation, but you can also submit questions or comments in the chat, which I'll be monitoring during the presentation this morning. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Schnitkey.
Good morning and welcome to this webinar. I'm Gary Schnitkey, and thanks Amanda for having us today. We all three of us are at the University of Illinois, and we have been working on carbon markets for a little bit now, actually for this year. And some of the information that we have put together are available on our FarmDoc website. We have, and if you go there, you can go see some of our information. Carbon Markets 101, which is a playlist. All of those are YouTube videos where we go over some of the details associated with carbon markets. That's a growing list, as well as our FarmDoc Daily articles. So if you have any suggestions there about what would be good to be put on there, that would be good. We also have some FarmDoc Daily articles that deal with this. Our very first one was what questions should farmers ask about selling carbon credits? And actually that kicked it all off. Sarah Sellars put that together, and she took the lead on this, as well as many of the other things that you're going to see here today. And that is a pretty good article, or a really good article, in my opinion, that looks at these issues. What we are going to do today is do three things. I am going to start out with just giving a little background about carbon markets and carbon efforts more in generally. Then we're going to go into questions about carbon markets, and at that point in time, Sarah is going to take over and then go through some of the questions that people may have about carbon markets and what you should look for as you're looking at these carbon markets. And then finally, Krista Swanson, the last member here today of our team, will be looking at advice for evaluating carbon markets. So as far as background, the results of the last election, Biden winning, and both are basically Democrats having control of both House and Senate, although you can argue about the Senate, I suppose, have a lot to do with where we're at today as far as climate change and carbon markets. Climate change has come to the front, and likely will be around for a while. And I would make the argument that emphasis is going to stay here for a while, and it's likely to stay here even if Congress or administration may change. For example, if the Republicans win control of either chamber or both chambers, that could change the trajectory, but it's not likely to change the emphasis on carbon markets. And the one thing that I would point to there is if you look at younger individuals, look at anybody that takes, or not anybody, but look at my classes in general at the University of Illinois, and for whatever reason there is a emphasis on or a concern about climate change among younger individuals. The stated policy objective is to have man-made activities, and that would be, man-made being carbon neutral. So what the goal is to, again, to have man-made activities, not releasing more carbon into the atmosphere and other related gases, then somehow it's being sequestered. So that's the stated objective. Right now, agricultural activities are being more looked at as a sink for carbon. So far, and if you look at what agriculture contributes according to the emissions, according to the EPA, it's 10%. Our bigger ones are industry, electric generation, and transportation. Those are the big three, accounting for close to 75% of the carbon emissions. Actually, if you want to do something about carbon emissions, you have to shrink that piece of the pie. But right now, agriculture is being looked to as a sink for carbon. So what people are saying is, if we change practices in agriculture, agriculture will sequester more carbon than it does currently, and that will aid us in getting to the goal of having zero carbon emissions. So what people are again saying, if we can change practices primarily of farmers, we can increase carbon sequestration in the soils primarily, and that will get us closer to net zero carbon emissions. Again, the US has pledged to reach net zero carbon emissions no later than 2050. And many private companies, and this is actually the demand for coming from for the soil carbon markets right now. Private companies also have set emission targets. And if you look at it, 1/5 of the world's largest publicly listed traded companies have adopted a net zero emission target. So Microsoft, for example, would be one of those. Actually, it's sort of interesting. Exxon is sort of moving in that direction too. And so these private companies right now, because of pressure probably being put on them by their customers and their shareholders, have begun to set these goals of net zero emissions. U.S. agriculture, and again, according to this estimate, could provide 10 to 20% of the sequestration and emissions reductions needed to meet that 2050 goal. And just to give you a feel, current sequestration on U.S. cropland is 100 million metric ton of CO2 equivalent per year. And you're going to see the CO2 equivalent per number come up again. But so they want to jump that 100 million to something greater than that number. Again, right now, that the approach to that has been generally incentive base. Here's a quote from Robert Bonney, and this was from last spring. They expect a suite of tools. Some of those are going to be policy oriented. Some of those are going to be private, like carbon markets, and they're generally incentive based. There is sort of a threat there that they could switch to non-incentive based somewhere down the road. That obviously would require some actions by Congress. Again, what we are seeing right now is two efforts going on simultaneously. One is congressional action, and one of those you're seeing here is the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which those activities are primarily targeted towards making primarily more on making carbon markets more transparent. There will be other activities likely from a congressional standpoint that will add perhaps more incentive-based sorts of things. So those are congressional actions that we have seen and could see down the road. And if on the government policy side, there are administrative activities as well. So you can think about the administration setting up something like a carbon bank or something along that lines, and or something along those lines where they don't need congressional action to cause caused that policy to come in place. And think of the MFP and CFAP programs. Neither one of those were legislated. They went through a CCC process, and essentially the only thing that could have stopped them was Congress saying not appropriating the money. So that's another government policy action. So those activities are going on. There's also these private carbon markets going on as well. Right now, the private carbon markets look like this. You have farmers who are going to sell carbon credits. Those carbon credits will have to be agreed on, but they're a carbon credit. There will be integrators, and you can think of pretty much every major technology or seed technology company. Cargill, several others are trying to be integrators. They will be buying credits from farmers and then selling those to other private entities. So there's three sort of bodies involved in there: farmers selling the credits, integrators acting as a go-between between the other group, the private entities. Those private entities are going to be primarily corporations. Think Microsoft, think several other, PepsiCo, several others that want to reach a goal of carbon neutrality and are willing to buy carbon credits to make that happen. So that is what the private carbon markets will be. And those markets will exist as long as there's private entities that want to buy the credits. And that's the key to this, well, how you think about it in the long run. So that's setting this up. Sarah is going to now talk about going through this. First off, talking about how we're going to measure this, because this is going to involve all these things. And so we're going into what farmers should be asking when they're looking at those carbon credits. And Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitkey. So one question we've been getting a lot is, how do you measure all this? So you can use remote sensing, which is using things like satellites to look at cover crops and tillage. Some pros are this is very scalable and it's inexpensive. Maybe it's not 100% accurate. Soil sampling, it's more expensive and not as easy to scale, but maybe some increased accuracy. And we can also use indicators, which are things like the amount of fertilizer added to the field, which can indicate the level of greenhouse gases. And then we can use computer models to tie together remote sensing, soil sampling, indicators, and other information. So tying together multiple methods is most feasible when we consider the cost, accuracy, and scale. So as interest grows in no-till and nitrogen reduction practices and cover crops, there are significant costs to adopting many of these practices, and carbon credits may present some financial incentive for farmers to adopt new practices that they may not otherwise receive. We have heard from companies that you can stack carbon credits with other programs, such as government programs, which would allow the farmer to reach approximately $40 to $50 per acre payment and help them to cover more of the cost of adoption. But this ability to stack programs could change as things evolve. Another thing to mention is there are co-benefits to many of these practices, such as improved soil health, benefits for the air, for biodiversity and water. So it's important to consider that as well. So if you look at the carbon market, there's a lot of difference between contracts when thinking about length, terms and conditions, and measurement. We've heard some companies describe it as the wild, wild west because everybody's kind of got a different requirements. And overall, a lot of farmers have some concerns about selling carbon credits. So let's get into a little more detail. So these are the break-even prices for some tillage practices, and the break-even price represents the carbon incentive level where adopting a carbon sequestration practice becomes economically viable for the farmer. So it's the point where the net present value of the benefits is equal to the net present value of the cost. For example, the price of carbon would need to be $32 per carbon credit for the farmer to break even from switching to conventional tillage to no-till on soybeans. And it's important to keep in mind that the break-even prices in Table 1 serve as a general estimate, and the actual break-even prices will vary from farm to farm, depending on costs and soil types. and other characteristics. Also, keep in mind that these break-even prices are from an article produced in 2013, so it's likely prices and costs have changed since then, but this can help to just give us an idea about some break-even prices. Another thing to think about is break-even enough incentive to adopt the practice? And so these numbers represent the price of one carbon credit, which is in dollars per metric ton of carbon dioxide. So if you want to put this in per acre terms, we need to multiply the break-even price by the emissions reduction potential. So if we look at corn, switching from reduced till to no till, we can multiply the $30 times the 0.42 emissions reduction potential, and we get $12.60 per acre. So here we have the break-even prices for some fertilizer practices. One thing to note is the VRT assumes a 1,000 acre farm and adoption of green seeker technology for nitrogen application. And they look at two different scenarios, a low nitrous oxide emissions reduction scenario and a high nitrous oxide emissions reduction scenario. And here we have a few scenarios that are pretty expensive because the emissions reduction potential is pretty small. And again, we can put this in per acre terms. So if we take the $174 from the 10% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer application rate from the low emissions reduction scenario, and we multiply that by the 0.03 emissions reduction potential, this is $5.22 per acre for a 10% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer rate. And here we have some break-even prices for land retirement practices. One thing to note here is organic soils are soils with high organic carbon content from decaying materials, such as histosols or muck. So here again, they look at two different scenarios, a low-cost scenario and a high-cost scenario. And the main takeaway here is the emissions reduction potential is pretty high for many of these practices, but these are not something we typically see companies paying for in agricultural carbon markets yet. And this is a slide about cover crops. So the previous study did not do a quantitative analysis of cover crops. So we collected a few studies talking about cover crops and carbon sequestration. Cover crops could play a large role in this. The average sequestration could be around 0.5 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And it really depends on the cover crop. One study suggests a carbon credit price of $10 per credit could meet a large percent of the mitigation potential of cover crops. Another thing to think about is what should the price of carbon be? Right now, we are seeing agricultural carbon markets mention prices of $10 to $20 per credit, but break-even price and the market price of carbon are two different things. And there's more than just agriculture involved in the carbon market and affecting this carbon price. So a couple of studies suggest credits are going to need to be closer to the $50 to $100 range by 2025 or in the future to meet this Paris Agreement target. So what are some questions farmers should ask about selling carbon credits? The first question is, how do I enter the carbon market? There are typically two approaches a farmer can use to enter the carbon market, an aggregator or a data manager. So with an aggregator, the farmer sells the entire project, control, and the credits to the aggregator in terms and conditions set up in a contract. The aggregator then has complete control over the carbon credits, when to sell, the price, and the data shared. And with a data manager, the farmer pays a data manager to help them enter the marketplace for a fee or a revenue percentage. And the farmer has not sold real interest in the project or carbon credits. Another big question farmers should ask is, how much will I actually be paid? There's a section of the Growing Climate Solutions Act titled Fair Treatment for Farmers. It would require USDA to ensure technical assistance. Providers help farmers, rangers, and foresters receive a fair distribution of the revenue derived from the sale of carbon credits. So this has not passed yet. So this kind of raises the question about whether the farmers who enroll now in some of these companies, if they're receiving a fair distribution of the revenue from selling their carbon credits. Another big question to ask is about the ownership of data and how the data can be shared. It's important to get a clear answer from the company about who owns your data, what can be done with your data, and how your data can be used or sold. Another question to think about is, what currency is my payment in? Most programs are paying in cash, but some have the option to choose between cash and cryptocurrency. Another question to ask is, how long will it take to get my money? So a portion of the money may be paid up front or issued at a future date. There may be a payment program to give the farmer a certain percentage of credits or payment gradually over a specified period. And some companies may pay the full amount up front. Another question to think about is, can carbon credits be stored? So we heard from one company that we spoke with that a lot of companies are expecting some upside potential in the market. So if the farmer does not get to keep or store the carbon credits, they could be losing out on some of this upside potential. Another question is, how much will it cost? The farmer might have to pay for the soil testing, or the company may cover this cost. And there could be other fees the farmer is responsible for, such as administrative fees, insurance fees, registration fees, transaction fees, or withholding for the natural loss of carbon. Sorry, my slides crashed. Let me pull this back up. Okay, sorry about that. So a big question for farmers has been if they can be paid for the practices they are already doing. Many feel so they should be eligible because they have already been doing many of these practices on their farm already. However, most companies say you had to have adopted the practice between at most 2 to 5 years ago. One company recently announced that they will pay for practices adopted up to 12 years ago. One other question to consider is, how long am I locked into a contract for? Typically, we see contracts between 10 and 20 years, but we all know a lot of things can change within this time period. So it's important to clearly understand any penalties for violating the contract and any liabilities the farmer has if the land changes hands. Another question to consider is, what happens if the land changes hands? So a lot of companies are building in buffer pools by purchasing more carbon credits than they are selling as a way to manage risk, with the expectation that some farmers will drop out of the program. Some companies state that they will deal with these situations of land changing hands on a case-by-case basis. So the outcome for farmers depends on the company and what is in the contract. So who needs to be involved in the decision to sell carbon? Some companies require an attestation of right to sell carbon, and others have a box that says, check here if you've received your landlord's permission. So there's a lot of variation out there in the contracts. What practices are companies paying for? Typically, we see payments for reducing tillage, changing nitrogen rate, or practices, planting cover crops, and changing crop rotation for crop farmers. There also may be opportunities in the future for livestock producers and forestry management. Another thing to consider is there a per acre limit of carbon credits. For example, if the company limits the farmer to 2 carbon credits per acre, and the farmer adopts practices that sequester more than this, then they may not receive that full benefit from the carbon they are sequestering. How often will someone need to verify my information? Someone may need to visit the farm to collect soil samples or verify information. So it's important to get a clear answer about how often this will need to occur. What are the penalties if the sequestration practice is discontinued? Like I mentioned before, a lot of companies are managing this risk by using buffer pools, by contracting for more credits than they need. So then the company is bearing the brunt of this risk. Other company may penalize the farmer for withdrawing or kind of have a settling up at the end. And another question to consider is if there is a limit to the total number of acres that can be enrolled. So we want to share this document. It was recently released by Iowa State University. It has a comparison of 11 private voluntary carbon markets. So they took our Farm Doc Daily article and went through some of the questions and tried to answer the questions and put this all in a document. So I think this could be a really helpful resource for farmers. And now I'll turn it over to Krista for more questions and answers.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Krista Swanson, and I don't think anyone said this at the beginning, but my husband and I actually farm here in Illinois as well, as my role with the team at the university. And so I kind of approach this section as a little bit of my farmer hat on as well. And so, Sarah just went through a lot of questions, and some of those we have answers to. And that document that she just referenced from Iowa State also helps provide another nice resource for finding information as a farmer. But I think that as a farmer, you still have a lot more questions than answers. And so I was going to talk through a few things about how do you evaluate from here. And so first, we need credible information. So there's a lack of neutral information and educational programs available. And that's kind of one thing that we're seeking to address with some of the work that Gary mentioned at the beginning on carbon markets that we have been putting out through FarmDoc. And Gary, or if you want to flip ahead to the next slide. So this is from a poll back in March, but Farm Journal polled farmers and asked the biggest reason why they would not participate or were not participating in a carbon market yet. And the poll showed that 64% of farmers wanted more trustworthy information to help them. And like I said, that's kind of what we've been working on, and others at other places like Iowa State have been as well. And so hopefully over the past few months, I know that more information is now available. I still think that we're in this phase of needing even more information. So separately, another poll, the March Ag Economy Barometer from Purdue University, showed that only 1% of the 400 farmers surveyed had actually signed a carbon market contract, even though 30 to 40% were aware of these opportunities. And since then, the additional number of farmers who have signed on hasn't been that huge. It's kind of a slow adoption so far, and that's because of this lack of information or needing more information. And so if we want to flip ahead to the next slide, another point for thinking about evaluation is the need for guidance and standards for transparency in how these programs operate, and also some more simplicity in how they operate. And so if we flip ahead to the next slide again, as Sarah has already discussed, there's a lot of differences in program structures between the different types of markets that are available. There's differences in contract terms and conditions and lengths. There's differences in how soil is measured, or if it's measured at all. There's also differences in how carbon is priced and how payments are calculated and how payments are made. So there's just a lot to wade through in terms of comparing. It's not really an apples to apples comparison. If you're interested in getting involved and you're trying to decide which program may be the best for you. So all of these things are creating a lot of confusion in a already complex space. And so I think if agriculture wants to be a part of the climate solution, we need some guidance to help us converge to an industry accepted set of standards on these things, which would help provide farmers with that transparency and simplicity. And it would also give us, I think, more credibility in what we can offer to the public and those interested in the carbon credits. Gary and Sarah had mentioned earlier the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and that has been passed by the Senate, and a companion bill is currently in the House. And given the super strong support in the Senate when it passed, it passed with 92 votes in the Senate. And so we kind of would have expected to see that move more quickly in the House, but it seems like there's more discussion over it there. But what it really is a good thing from a farmer perspective, what that bill would do would be to address some of these problems. It would help establish a baseline for what is a carbon credit, and kind of just set some framework and parameters for how it would still allow the private market to operate. It would just kind of, like I said, establish a better framework for some standards and how that market would operate. And then another thing is just thinking about a long-term plan. So every farmer has farm goals and knows what those are, and those are going to differ from farm to farm. And so as you think about for farmers thinking about getting involved in this marketplace, the right, what's the right fit for one farmer in terms of approach to take may not be the right fit for another one. So different farmers have different objectives, and it seems like so far the indication we're getting from USDA, Gary mentioned that quote from Robert Bonney earlier. It seems like they're planning on a suite of tools and opportunities for farmers. So the USDA and leaders in there have indicated that the carbon marketplace might be the right fit for some, and there might be other types of climate related opportunities for others. And so there's a policy goal of making sure that there's tools for producers that fit their interests and their objectives, both within the carbon marketplace and otherwise. So I really think that you start with a strategic view of what do you want to be doing on your farm, and are some of these things something that you could get paid for through the carbon marketplace that would make it even more desirable for you to do. A few topics to watch as we go forward. So first, the Paris Agreement. So this is an international treaty on climate change between almost every nation in the world. And it's basically commitments from countries to reduce their emissions and working together to address climate change. But there's one section of the Paris Agreement that has not yet been decided upon, and that within that is the suggestion for an international carbon market. It's expected that would be something that will be discussed at a meeting later in November of this year. And so that's just something to kind of keep an eye on, depending on what comes about within that. And, if some sort of international level carbon market's established, that could influence how things are operating here. We also have some, the additionality and carbon leakage are both terms that aren't really fully defined yet. The idea of additionality means that carbon offsets, the carbon offsets that are generated need to represent a true reduction in greenhouse gas emissions beyond business as usual. It means that you would have to do something that is new and something that brings about lasting change. And then carbon leakage has to do with making sure that as changes are being made, we aren't losing the progress that's been made. And then also climate related legislation. A lot of the legislation that's going through, whether it pertains to agriculture or not, definitely has climate related aspects that could impact our industry. And so that's always something to watch going forward here. And it seems like a lot of what's happening has some sort of twist related to climate. And then in summary, there's definitely a strong drive for action to address climate change, and agriculture can be part of that solution. And we have opportunities to do that, particularly carbon markets have emerged as an opportunity. In general, we would say that carbon prices are still too low to be economically feasible from the farm side, which means that there's some upside potential in that marketplace. There's also some indications that there may be some new or expanded government programs related to conservation and the ability to maybe get involved with a carbon contract and then also maybe receive some sort of payment from the government for doing the same practice. We also want to watch new climate policy, the possibility for USDA Carbon Bank. That's looking less and less likely. The report that was released by USDA in May with kind of the goals and outlines for the future didn't mention a carbon bank, but Robert Bonney, who was just officially accepted into his position at USDA last week, has been a huge proponent of USDA carbon banks. So, I don't know what will become of that. The USDA does seem to be very supportive of the private carbon markets regardless, though, in everything that they're doing. And then again, for farmers entering the market, choose a program that fits your own farm sustainability goals. And just kind of a disclaimer, these contracts can be long-term binding contracts. So just be sure to use careful consideration in what you're doing. And it's always a good idea before signing anything of that nature to have an attorney review, just to be sure that there's no legal language in those that that you weren't aware of, to be sure that you fully understand everything, all the parameters of the contract. So with that, that concludes what we had planned to present, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Well, thank you so much for presenting that information. Are there some questions from some of the directors that are on our staff to begin with? If not, I will kick off with one while everyone thinks of something else. So Sarah, I think it was during your portion of the presentation and talking about sort of the cost of carbon and how that really helps to influence what is going to be essentially the price for the carbon credit. I guess my question is especially in the private market, how are they determining that cost of carbon? I think there was a study that was cited in your slide for the social cost of carbon. I think it was $50. But is that how the private market is determining what that cost of carbon is? That's helping to set what those ultimately those carbon credit prices are? Is like using literature, or are they using other methods to look at setting that cost of carbon?
I mean, that's a great question. I think that's a good point. You know, the social cost and what someone finds in a study may not actually happen in real life, you know, because even if that's, you know, the socially optimal cost, that we might not reach that. So I'm not sure exactly how these carbon prices are being set, how people are getting this $10 to $20 per credit. It seems a little bit, there seems to be a lot of variation, but we did talk to one company and they are expecting the price to go up. I don't know how much that could be, and I don't know if that will happen. I think it depends on demand from companies and also policy. But yeah, good question. And if anyone else has anything they want to add.
So I guess I would add right now, those prices are being determined in corporate boardrooms, right? And how they come up with that is their prerogative right now. And they obviously want to buy those as cheap as they can. I mean, that's their objective. And actually, this is a good question that's on here. Would the carbon market be applied equally to industry where they could capture carbon and pump it into caverns or pressurize a well to extract more oil? And that's actually a very good question. But yes, there will be competitors to agriculture sequestering carbon. And a lot of that could be the company's own changing of their own practices to reach carbon neutrality. But your question about whether would they, so here's the question in the box. Would it apply equally to capturing carbon markets if it's pumped into caverns or pressurized a well to extract more oil? And I would bet you right now that those two answers, the answers to those two sources would be different. And pumping them in caverns would be higher probably than pumping them into oil. And let me tell you why I think that. And I'm just guessing, by the way, but scientific guess. Let's put it that way. So you know, if you follow, if you're doing cover crops and you're using no-till, it doesn't matter a lot when you adopted that practice. You're still sequestering carbon, right? Whether it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But right now, companies want additional ones. And that's why they're paying their that requirement that you do it in addition in certain cases. Bayer doesn't, but well, in the last 12 years, but others do because they want to buy additional. So right now there isn't, well, you can say there's a carbon credit here. Carbon credits aren't all the same right now. So that's a murky answer to your question.
Another one that came in, but maybe it was mentioned earlier. If signed on to a program, has it been mentioned what happens if you have a field signed up and you do tiling or have to work up ruts left into the field? So if there's some of that disturbance on the field.
All right, so you don't know, but here's if you are signing, so some of these contracts you're signing to do practices on those fields, and then they have a model that says you've created this much carbon. In certain cases, certain carbon credits, in certain cases that's good enough. In certain cases they want to verify it. But if you don't follow the practices, you're not going to get the carbon, right? You know, so each one of those two things, you've not done the model requirement, so there's going to be an offset there most likely. So if you say you're going to do no-till and then you till, you're sort of not, you've ruined the model results.
And then
think
if
that-
there, oh, sorry.
Oh,
I was
go
just
So
gonna-
I was just going to jump in and say, I think that maybe that varies from program to program too. I don't know that there's a flat answer across the board on that necessarily.
Sure. And then have you seen in some of these contracts then, are there penalties associated with that? If it then does, if there is a practice, if it was no-till and then there is tiling that happens or other work in the field, are there penalties that are built into these contracts?
So we gave a presentation a couple weeks ago, and a company also presented there too. And they pay like half the money up front, and then the other half they measure, and you get based on like the amount of carbon sequestered. And their model is predicting like half a metric ton of carbon sequestered. Their price was $20. So you would get $5 in the fall, and then $5 after you prove that you stored the carbon. So maybe if you tilled, or then when they measured, maybe the carbon wouldn't be there, so maybe you wouldn't get the other $5. But programs like that, if you've already gotten the $5, you don't have to get it back, but it depends on the program.
So this next question coming from Doug is about just asking if we have an estimate of how much carbon can soil in Minnesota hold, and are there examples of different soil types and organic matter content? We're going to talk about markets this morning. I think we will be talking about this topic too in the future, but if you all have any input on that too for this current question, that would be great as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Sarah was good, I think.
Oh yeah, so we've been getting hearing that question. A lot of farmers have been asking, is there a limit to the amount of carbon that can be stored in the soil? And we weren't sure, so we talked with a soil scientist the other day, and what they told us is, yes, there is a limit to the amount of carbon that can be stored in soil. This amount will vary according to different factors such as soil type, vegetation, climate, and elevation. One of the most important factors is the soil texture. For example, fine textured soils such as clay soils can accumulate more carbon than sandy soils.
So I don't know if this is exactly the same translation into Minnesota, but in Illinois, a prairie soil would hold more than a timber soil because just because of the texture. So generally speaking, your better soils will have the ability to store more carbon.
Good question, though.
Yeah, good question, absolutely. And that's trying to figure out that measurement and understanding how much the potential is that's there.
By the way, on your other question, Sarah mentioned this, that they're going to measure it at the end and then settle up. There's a possibility that measurement isn't going to match what their models say. And if you can think about this, if I asked any farmer, what's the pH of that field, 100-acre field, the sampling you do is going to matter. on your answer, right? So if you do grid sampling and go back to the grids every time, same point, you're going to get a different answer than if you do some other one. So the other thing you got to keep in mind here as you're moving forward, I think, is that if we're going to do testing, those tests there's a standard error associated with the test as well. So that issue is going to come up as you're moving forward, as you sign up for these contracts as well.
Other questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can also unmute. And if you wanted to ask your question as well, that would work too.
I got one. Has there been any talk about who's going to actually set these standards, you know, for what soil type holds how many tons of carbon or something? Is it just right now just industry setting, or is there actually going to be somebody that's going to set something so we can go by consistently?
So the Growing Climate Solutions Act that I mentioned would direct USDA to establish some baselines for those types of things. So at this point, there's not anything happening there that, like I said, that passed the Senate with very strong bipartisan support, and then hasn't really gone anywhere in the House. So, but anyway, yeah, that's kind of one of the problems that I was referring to, is that we have a whole lot going on and not really any standards.
So there would have to be some sort of legislation likely to get that in place. You can think of, you have CFTC governing futures markets. We don't have that now for carbon markets. Right now, if you sign, so one example, you sign up, or you go to an individual company, you enter your information into a model. You said you've done it in the past, you're going to do this now. The model is going to say that will result in X additional carbons. So that's the standard right now. And that's how one company is doing it. And that would be obviously dependent on the model that they're using. And they were going to do some truing up at the end, but a lot of it's model driven right now. So.
Well, I have a question here. If you're using modeling, how much is contingent in that model upon rainfall? This is coming from an individual in Western Minnesota who has gotten less than 5 inches of rain for the growing season. I barely got corn and beans that are alive, much less growing a cover crop. And so I would assume if you've got adequate rainfall and you've got pretty good growth out there, you have probably got more carbon being sequestered in that ground.
Yeah. Yes, you are correct. And I don't know. When they run those models, they're assuming sort of quote unquote normal weather. And if you don't get normal weather, I mean, if nothing's growing out there, you're not sequestering carbon. So, or less growth, you know.
Sounds like a new federal crop insurance program to me.
There was another question in the chat, and Sarah, I think this might apply to the portion of your presentation. And looking at there was around the break-even cost for the different tillage practices with conventional and no-till, and that was based upon 2010 data. So from your perspective, would you estimate that those break-even prices have increased, decreased, or relatively unchanged?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. Dr. Schnitkey, did you have an idea about, or Krista?
So the biggest thing that changed from 2010 was the price of commodities. Well, right now may not be have changed, but 2010, we had better, I think, commodity prices than a couple years ago. And higher commodity prices would probably change the break even. The lower the commodity prices, the break evens would go down. But I don't know how much. That's a good question. The practices likely wouldn't have changed sequestration much.
Any other questions in the couple minutes that we have left this morning?
This is Wes. I'm not sure how to say this, but this seems to be a infant stage of moving forward. Saving the planet is a very noble goal. I think it's probably going to cost us more than $10 an acre to do that. And there's going to be a lot of the costs, and you're going to give up a lot of control and have a lot of other things that $10 an acre wouldn't cover my administrative costs of dealing with those headaches. And it seems that there's more unknowns than there are knowns on this process. So I don't know why you'd want to. We're going to be saving the planet for a long time. I think it's going to cost more than $10 an acre.
Your sentiment is pretty widespread. Let's just say that. I'm not. So, having said that, some of these contracts are like 1 year commitments. I'm, trying it on a limited number of acres just to get some experience might not be a bad thing to do as well. See what's going on, but.
You can also look at, on some of those longer term ones, pay attention to their rules for dropping out of the program. One thing I find very interesting is that one of the programs with a longer term, all the language about it indicates that it's, a long-term commitment, and that, once you're in and everything. But then if you look into the fine print, it actually says that you can drop out at any time with 30 days notice. Now, I probably wouldn't rely on that without having an attorney or someone just verify that I was following everything correctly. But anyway, so sometimes some of those things are a little bit confusing, because it almost seems why have the long-term commitment and the long-term contract if that's what it takes to get out. So again, just paying attention to all those things. I would probably lean towards a shorter term program, or one that I knew I could opt out of if the whole dynamics of everything changed.
I would be.
That's my personal answer.
Yeah, I would probably, my personal answer, I would look at shorter term contracts more based on practices than on measurement, which there's a couple out there. The concern then you have, though, is the minute you sign up for one of those contracts, do you limit yourself somewhere down the way? So let me give you an example. One contract says, I adopt these new practices this year and I'll get paid. Well, should I wait a year to adopt those practices and maybe get paid more? And there's no way that we know one way or other what's going to happen there. So, but right now you're thinking that you're going to get paid $10 an acre. That's sort of the ballpark, and maybe $5 to $10 an acre. And we've already told you more than we know, so take that with a grain of salt.
I've got a follow-up question along that same line. If the program is administered by the government, how transparent will that be as to what the farmers are getting paid, what the broker in the middle is getting paid, and what the actual value is going to be to the purchaser of those, and how fluid they'll be able to be traded? Companies merge, companies go out of business, new companies are formed. I can see having the government administer this program instead of throwing it onto the New York Stock Exchange or Chicago markets. Although there we do have transparency. We know that the broker gets paid, you know, 0.5 cent a bushel for exercising the contract, but we don't know actually what the end user is getting out of those markets. He might buy my corn for 7 and sell it for 9.
So how transparent do you think crop insurance is? That's probably.
Well, that's not a fair question because my wife is my crop insurance agent. So I've got a pretty good idea what the middleman picks up in there.
Well, I mean so it would probably look something like the crop insurance market if the government gets involved with it. So there, I would guess.
Well, I just threw it out as being a concern.
No, yeah.
Farmer's always worried he's coming up on the short end.
Yeah, I get that. Right now, I guess the bigger, or not bigger, but another worry is, you know, we don't really know what. There's not a standard definition of. There is a standard definition of carbon credit, but it's not being applied the same. Companies right now in these carbon markets want a new carbon credit, right? Not, it isn't a carbon credit, it's a quote unquote new one. And that doesn't impress me as being long run sustainable. You have to pay for them all, or they're all worth the same, or they're, I don't know.
Well, want to be respectful of everyone's time, and this has been a great presentation. So thank you, Dr. Schnitkey and Krista and Sarah, and thank you to the good questions from our leaders and staff on this and having this discussion. There's a lot more to continue to be talking about and monitoring as this continues to emerge. We had our big farm show this week, Farm Fest, and there was a lot of discussion there on this, but one of the first panels included former Undersecretary Bill Northey. And one of the pieces of advice that he had was, this is probably going to be around for some time with these carbon markets. And he had sort of advised that it's probably not best to kind of jump right in to the first thing that you get offered, but there is going to continue to be more offerings, and this will continue to sort of evolve. So something to definitely keep a watchful eye on and be looking and evaluating options and information. But that was his counsel that I thought share to close us out this morning. So thanks everyone. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.